Hello and welcome back to the Thematic Intelligence Podcast. At Global Data's Thematic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Alex Blair, and today I'll be speaking with Donatella Rovera, Senior Crisis Advisor at Amnesty International. We'll discuss the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the supply of arms to the Israeli Defense Forces, and the genocide case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Donatella, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
So as we speak, in the middle of May 2024, Israel is ramping up its military ground offensive in Rafah, southern Gaza, despite international condemnation over the humanitarian threat this poses to the Palestinian population, which already faces severe famine. Could you dissect this from a human rights perspective, if you would, Donatella? Have we reached a tipping point?
Well, I think the tipping point was reached quite a while ago. And I think it's important to frame it correctly. It's not it's not just a humanitarian crisis, and it is first and foremost a human rights crisis, as a result of which we're seeing a humanitarian crisis. I mean, most of the time people think of a humanitarian crisis in terms of natural disasters or places that for one reason or another cannot be reached because it's too far, because the roads have been destroyed, earthquake, floods, a variety of issues. Here it is entirely man-made. The delivery of aid to Gaza, of aid and of imports, of whatever the civilian population needs to survive, it's possible. It's not only possible, it's very, very easy. The roads are excellent all the way up to the entry into Gaza. It's just that the Israeli forces that control the border, and it's important to note that the Israeli forces control all the borders of Gaza, the sea, the entry from Israel and the entry from Egypt. Anybody or anything to go in and out of Gaza through Egypt requires the permission and the approval of the Israeli authorities, the Israeli army. And that permissions has not been forthcoming to the extent that it should have been. And that's why at a time when people need so much more because of the widespread destruction and the fact that the economy isn't working anymore since October because of the conflict, so little has been allowed to go into Gaza. And that's why we have people facing absolutely abject condition, both in terms of everything that we all take for granted that people need to survive, food, hygiene material, but also medicines and equipment which is necessary to save lives, medical equipment. All of that is in very short supply, not available at different times in different places. So, that's just to lay the grounds.
And this is coming from an intentional restriction, an intentional denial of access to these food, medical and whatnot supplies.
It is indeed. As I said, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of lorries that have been waiting on the Egyptian side of the Rafah crossing. Material that is, some of which is being spoiled just by sitting there for such a prolonged period of time, not just weeks, but months, and it not being allowed to go in. There is only one reason for that, and that is that the Israeli authorities are not allowing that material in. That's the tragedy, really. It's also important to note that this is not a problem that has started on the 7th of October. The blockade imposed by the Israeli authorities and the Israeli army on Gaza has been going on for 16 years, to various degrees of intensity, but it has been there all the time, continuously. I remember back in 2008, 2009, having discussions with other humanitarians, with those who were negotiating to try and get humanitarian aid into Gaza, humanitarian aid and imports, and issues like toilet paper, pasta, jam, basic material not being allowed in. So it's been a long-standing problem, and it has already had very serious consequences on the civilian population from before the 7th of October. That is to say that when the 7th of October situation occurred, the atrocities that were committed by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups against Israeli civilians inside Israel, when all of that happened and the subsequent Israeli attacks on Gaza, Gaza was already in a coma situation. The civilian population, the hospitals, the humanitarian sectors were already surviving in sort of like emergency mode. So there was very little coping mechanism, there was very little by way of reserves. And so the coping mechanism, to the extent that, whatever little existed, those were exhausted very quickly because there was so little of it. And so now it is immeasurably worse, unimaginably worse. I don't think anybody could have expected that level of destruction and that level of deprivation, of deliberate deprivation, on top of that level of deliberate infliction of death and destruction on civilians, not on the infrastructure of the armed groups, but on the civilian population. I don't think that anybody could fathom things being as dire as that.
And of course, much of the international attention is focused on where the weapons that are inflicting this destruction that you talk about have come from. Now, last week, US President Joe Biden announced a pause in the shipment of some US bombs and artillery shells to Israel. And despite Rishi Sunak's claims in the House of Commons last week, the UK also supplies Israel with components for F-35 and F-16 fighter jets, naval vessels, utility helicopters, etc. What will it take for the US, UK, and other countries internationally to suspend arms sales to Israel?
That is a very good question, and that is a question that those who are continuing to send weapons in the full knowledge that these weapons and other military supplies are very likely to be used in a manner that is inconsistent with international humanitarian law, that violates international humanitarian law, that also violates the laws of the countries that are sending those weapons and military equipment, US law, UK law, but only they can answer that question. And of course, much has been made of the decision of the United States administration to delay the sending of a small part of what is an enormous, huge amount of military supplies that have gone and that continue to go to the Israeli army in the full knowledge that they are being used in a way that violates international humanitarian law. So again, it's very important that is not that everything has stopped. First of all, Israel is a big producer of weapons, so they're not just using what's coming from outside to kill and injure civilians and to destroy civilian properties. But then they've received an enormous amount, and they continue to receive. So, yeah, and why aren't more governments that are sending military equipment and weapons also stopping? Only they can answer.
From what you've seen, from what Amnesty International's own investigations have uncovered, what specifically are the international violations of law that you know to be concrete facts that have been committed in the Gaza Strip right now?
Well, first and foremost, unlawful killings of civilians in large numbers, because indiscriminate attacks are being carried out, as well as attacks which, from what our investigations have revealed, are very likely also deliberate attacks on civilians and not just indiscriminate attacks, as well as disproportionate attacks. Now, all of these three categories, disproportionate attacks that result in disproportionate harm to civilians and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks that harm civilians and destroy and damage civilian properties, as well as deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian property. All these three categories of attacks are violations of international humanitarian law, and they constitute war crimes. I should add that this is not the first time that we've seen all these three types of attacks being carried out. We've seen them being carried out in previous bouts of conflict in Gaza in 2008-9, Operation Cast Lead, in 2014, in 2021. We've also seen them being carried out in a different way and to a different extent in the West Bank, other parts of the occupied Palestinian territories. So this is not something new, and that is what makes the systematic nature, the widespread natures of this attack even clearer, because we've seen that when particular attacks attract a lot of international attentions, the Israeli authorities tend to answer, and they tend to say, we're investigating, it was a mistake, we didn't mean to. In the majority of cases, which is tens and tens and tens and tens of civilians being killed and hundreds being injured every day, the Israeli army, the Israeli authority doesn't even bother to answer. But in those particular cases that attract international attention, they do. And they usually say, we're investigating, we're sorry, we made a mistake, something went wrong, etc. Now, those explanations are exactly the same. They are identical to the explanation that the Israeli army and the Israeli authorities have been providing for not just years, but decades. So when a party persists in using certain techniques, like bombing houses full of civilians in the middle of the night when everybody's in the house, knowingly so, and they know because they've been doing it for years and years and years, and they know that in the overwhelming majority of cases, the outcome is almost sure to be a lot of civilians killed and injured, and perhaps zero or very few members of armed groups or legitimate targets being harmed. Those are textbook cases of disproportionate strikes. You know, when the same practice is used again and again and again over not just, weeks, months, years, the fact that every time saying, we're so sorry, we didn't mean to, the outcome to be what it is, when it's virtually sure, known in advance to be exactly that, then it's not credible, and it's an indication that, that this is deliberate. Likewise, the fact that there has been a very, very well-proven track record of impunity. Again, going back not just months, but years and decades, Israeli soldiers, members of the armed forces that have been held accountable, investigated, prosecuted, convicted, and held accountable is so insignificant. It's so small that it's insignificant. It almost never happened. The cases that do happen are absolutely exceptional. So again, it is this impunity that has become so entrenched. That is why we're seeing in this particular conflict, more than in previous ones, Israeli soldiers filming themselves carrying out wanton destruction, gratuitous destruction, torturing captives, for example, and posting it on social media. They do that because they feel absolutely confident that they will not be held accountable, that they will not have to answer for any crimes that they've committed, because that's the way it's been for a very, very long time, for many years. And they have absolutely no reason to feel that there is anything that's going to be done differently on this occasion.
Absolutely. And I imagine now that all eyes will turn to the IDF's actions in Rafah and the ICJ's verdict, but as to what will happen there remains to be seen. Donatella Rivera, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate you coming on the show.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And thanks to you all for listening from us and Thematic Intelligence. See you next time.